Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome for a very special edition of Spotlight on IGN Pakistan. Today we have the pleasure of showcasing uh, one of the most original works of animated content that has ever come out of Pakistan. Of course, I'm talking about the Glassworker, and we're extremely excited to host the creator of the Glassworker, Usman Riaz, on this very special edition of Spotlight by IGN Pakistan. Hi, Usman. Thank you so much for coming over. I know it's a crazy schedule for you, but we're so happy to have you on board. Thank you for coming.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We did something different this time. We reached out to the community on Discord, and we compiled a bunch of questions that they wanted to know. So they're in no particular order, but they are fun questions. So let's just kick it off. So I think the most obvious question people want to ask is because it's quite famously known that you were doing this for almost a decade or more than a decade, right? Which means you were like 22 when you started.
I was 23 when I started.
When I started. So, and that means you already had an idea when you started. So, what was that initial spark of idea that led you to create the Glassworker? Was this something you saw in your teens, a character, a theme? Because you had to have that idea well in your teens, right? So, tell us a little bit about it. Why the Glassworker? What was it?
The genesis of the entire project probably. There are two things. One is just the idea that went into the film, the ideas that went into the film. The glass blowing came from a visit when I saw the Murano glass blowers in Italy, and I always wondered why nobody had made a film on this craft, because the craft was just as interesting as the end result, which is the beautiful glass sculptures. So I saw that and just kind of tucked it away at the back of my head. Didn't really think much about it. And as the years went by and the opportunity came to make my own film, that's the first idea I pulled out of my ideas list that I had in my head. That's where the idea for the glass blowing came.
And how far back was that from your
I think I was 15 or 16 years
Oh, so you
old.
really tucked it away somewhere.
Yeah, I just kept thinking, why has nobody made a film on this? And it was just an idea, a question that was in my head. I didn't really think I'm going to make a film on this later. It just was a question that intrigued me. And then as I got older and the opportunity came to make this my own film, that's the idea I pulled out. That we'll center it around glass blowing and the juxtaposition of glass trap in wartime is just such a interesting metaphor. The most fragile of things
Oh yes.
in
The most chaotic.
most chaotic, destructive environment. So that's what I was thinking. The mind of a 23-year-old when I started
And
making
not to
this.
mention that glass working, or glass, the look of glass translates very well. I am lucky enough to have seen the movie, and thank you for inviting me. And it just lends so much to the animation process and the coloring process, because it's glass and you get to show colors, and you have. So I think not that you thought that was the reason you wanted to do it, but it just translated so well.
No, actually, that was a big reason
Really?
I wanted to do it, because in animation, in live action, I knew that uh, it's a very unpredictable craft. When we visited a lot of glass blowers in London, we went to Peter Layton's glass studio. And one of the more experienced glass blowers said that you have to just let go, and the glass has a mind of its own, and all you can do is bend it and shape it, but there's no guarantee how the piece is going to end up. But that's the beauty of it. With animation, we were able to control the lighting, we were able to control just everything. While they were making the glass, we could control the colors. All of those things lended really well to animation. So animation and glass blowing was a great combination.
I think, yeah. Now that you put it like that, definitely. But that brings me to another question. So you had that idea, you saw something in Murano when you were 15, 16, then you brought it to some life genesis in 20, like when you were 23 years old. um, how has can you walk me through the journey or the development process of this film, in the sense that how has the story, the character, or whatever you had in mind changed from your, well, I won't say naive, but from your initial view and approach to it to what we see today? Like,
No, that's a
I'm
great
sure it was
question.
hardly different, right?
That's a great question. When I started off, it was just me alone drawing on my desk. And I think the characters, the look came pretty quickly. I knew what I wanted the characters to look like, I knew what I wanted the world to be like, and I knew what the glass shop and what its symbolism and would be in the film. Those things came
Yeah.
fairly quickly. And then I just kept iterating upon everything. Before there was a whole team, it was just me, and I would constantly show Mariam my ideas. Mariam is the co-founder of Mano Animation Studios and also my wife, and Khizr, my cousin and a partner at the studio. The three of us run the studio. I would show them the sketches, and it just kept evolving. The story started off initially as a short film because I thought there's no way we'll be able to do a feature film, especially if we want to make it in Pakistan. And actually, even before I thought of making it in Pakistan, the first place I thought of was Japan. I'm a TED senior fellow, so I attend the main TED conferences that happen in Vancouver. And after I had begun work on the sketches and ideas and initial drafts of the story, I had a huge portfolio case that I would carry around at the TED conference and just show people, hoping that they would point me in the right direction, because TED has so many amazing people attending from film studios and various other places. So nobody really.
And this was the portfolio stuff you'd made yourself.
Yes, this was a portfolio just filled with my sketches in April 2015. And I wound up speaking to an organizer of TEDx Tokyo. His name was Patrick Newell, and I begged him to let me come to Japan and showcase my ideas. That's how I spoke at TEDx Tokyo. And when I gave that talk, it was about my love for the Japanese animation industry. It was about my love for the craft of animation. And I gave that talk, and magically after that, I was invited to my favorite animation studio in the world, which is Studio Ghibli. And every time I talk about this story, I start crying. So I'm gonna try to control myself. But I went there, and there was a very kind man, Shin Hashida, who showed me around, and I sat with him and showed him all of my sketches from my portfolio case, and he said, "Look, you're clearly talented. You clearly know what you want. I would recommend, instead of working in Japan, you start your own studio." And that was really the turning point, because Mariam and I had had conversations about this, but um, that really kind of drove the point home, because he said that you'll have control over what you're making, and in Japan it'll be difficult for you to kind of rise up the ranks. It was a very candid conversation. He said you might get to make this movie in 5, 6, 7, 8 years, maybe not even then. So and it still ended up taking 10 years, which is amazing. But that was the jumping off point. The leap of faith was there. Okay, we're going to do this in Pakistan. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to figure it out. And now 10 years later, here we are.
And here you are, and you probably have a team that's unmatched on the kind of skill set that they have, because you've trained them in something that didn't exist here. And that's your secret sauce now. So the kind of content that you inshallah produce, which will take hopefully not another 10 years, will be stuff that will be very, very special to Mano Studios, because it'll have your imprint on it, the kind of training you've done. And having someone from Ghibli telling you, "Yeah, ye karo," you're like, I'm on the right path, man.
It was a great visit, and I was so grateful for it, because it was so honest, and I really appreciated that he told me straight up, "I think you should do this." And not thinking much about it. Obviously, they probably see extremely talented people on a daily basis. To see me might not have been anything special for them, but for me it was very special.
But have you kept in touch over the years? Do they know how you've done, or is it,
I would like to think so. I would like to think so.
do they know this is coming out? Did you send it to that person?
The actually Jeffrey Wexler from Studio Ponok. He's the chief of international of Studio Ponok, and he was the English language producer for the Studio Ghibli films. Him I've been in touch with since the project started, and he's been a wonderful mentor. And he was at the NSC premiere, and I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for all the people I've met on this journey.
I think one of the best things that you realize is that there are good people out there who are willing to, if nothing else, sit down and listen to you and
Yes,
few words of advice. And it's
definitely.
very important because there must have been extremely low moments in these last 10 years when you were like, yeah, let me cut my losses early and just not make it. I don't know if that ever happened, but it happens to everybody. And I'm sure there were moments where you thought, ki, bas yaar.
It was very hard. That I'm not going to sugarcoat. It was very hard maintaining the same level of passion and commitment, because I convinced so many people that this was possible. Because I still, when even in the darkest of times, I always thought it was going to get done. It was this kind of obsessive focus to achieve this. I really believed in it, but it was difficult to maintain that for other people. So to constantly be in front and leading the charge and picking others up when things were dark was very tough. But I'm on the other side now, and the film is done, so I'm very grateful. And like I said, I worked with a brilliant team in Pakistan and a brilliant team internationally to get this project done. And I think everybody put everything they had into it. And for me, it was I drew all of the storyboards for the film. I could see it in my head. I knew exactly what I wanted to look like. So it was a matter of achieving that vision, and obviously the end result will never be exactly what you see in your head, but it's a as close as you can get making a first time hand drawn animated film in Pakistan. So very grateful for everybody who I worked with.
So, um, every time we create something, like even when we create music, for example,
Mhm.
you do as well, um, or even animation or movies, there's always a lot of our own experiences that go into it.
Yeah.
Whether we realize it or not, right? Uh, so how does what you produced finally, how does it reflect your own experiences growing up in Pakistan or otherwise? Uh, and are there any specific people, places, traditions, memories that have worked their way into what you've created?
I think the most um, with the main characters, both Vincent and Elise, they're both sides of my personality. I'm a composer and a performer, so I wrote a lot of music growing up, and performed on amazing stages all over the world. I'm very grateful for that experience. So the music side and that creation side, Elise's character embodies that, and the the difficult the difficulties in writing your own music, and what does that mean versus also having a classical music repertoire, and to find the balance within that character was very interesting. And then there's the craftsman side in Vincent. I'm an artist and a animator, and all of those things are embodied in Vincent's glass blowing. So to find and navigate both parts of my psyche was very interesting, exploring it within these two characters. So I really enjoyed that. And then of course, we worked with Moya O'Shea on the screenplay. The initial story draft that I had written, Moya came in and really refined it. Moya, some backstory for who Moya is. When Jeffrey Wexler came on board, he recommended that we work with David Friedman. David Friedman was the voice director. I think he worked with Jeff on the dubs for The Wind Rises and other Ghibli films. So David is a phenomenally talented man. And David Friedman was busy when we were writing our initial drafts for the second screenplay. David recommended that we work with Moya O'Shea. Moya O'Shea was his protege, and she had done a lot of work for BBC Radio, and even Peppa Pig. So it was
Oh,
cool to have somebody with that experience on board. And we worked with Moya. She kind of they both actually came to Karachi in 2018. Jeffrey Wexler and Moya O'Shea came to Karachi and absorbed the world around with us. And then we had a script summit in June where we sat for 5 days and just worked on the story. Because story is the most important
Yeah.
thing. If the story is not impactful and the animation is beautiful, you just have a bunch of pretty pictures. So I wanted to focus primarily on making a good story. And we were able to do that. And then the like 7-8 months after that initial session, we kept iterating on the story till we had the final version, and then we went into full scale production in 2019. So coming back to aspects of myself that are in the film, also a lot of people, I mean, Moya put in a lot of development in the characters that I initially didn't agree with, but then we kind of sat and hashed it out and discussed how it could work, and it was a very very collaborative process, and she did an incredible job, and all three of us, Khizr, Mariam, and I, we were very very happy with the script.
and I've seen the end product in Urdu, right? Because you shook in Urdu, and one of the things that I saw in it was that because of the language, you tend to create some form of association as a viewer, not as a creator, as a viewer. But I'm genuinely very excited to see it in English because I really want to understand that am I associating cultural cues because I'm hearing it in Urdu, or do those cultural cues also exist if I watch it in English? If you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I feel
Right.
it.
So like I did find a few things that were very cultural cues from Pakistan, for example, or the subcontinental culture.
Yeah.
But I'm generally on the fence that did I really feel it, or is it simply because conversation Urdu mein ho rahi thi, right? And so I came back and I told my team as well. I said I want to watch it in English because I want to understand the context all over again. Because I feel that to me, now that I've seen it, it's going to be a very different movie for me in English. I somehow feel that.
No, you're not wrong regarding that. They're different flavors, both films, and this was uh, the experience was interesting because I initially planned the whole film as an Urdu film because I thought,
Yeah, you told me.
how on earth will we get any international people interested in this? So we'll just make a kind of 60-70 minute film for Pakistan, and we'll see what we can do moving forward. And hopefully, this film will launch the next one. But what happened was the international talent all came on board for the first film, which was a huge shock to me, but I was tremendously grateful. And they said we should shift production to English. And I agreed with them because we were beginning to work with so many people internationally, and English was the one common language. So,
Yeah, very honestly, I tell this to a lot of people as well. People tend to get overly nationalistic about this. I'm like, they can't. At the end of the day, it's also a business.
yeah.
So the more number of people that watch the content means Mano can produce more content.
Yeah. So what happened was we took a call that okay, we'll shift from Urdu to English. When worked on the English version of the film, we worked with a wonderful voice cast, people like Art Malik, Sasha Dhawan, Anjali Mohindra, all phenomenal Hollywood and British talent. And once that version was close to completion, picked up the Urdu version again and began to refine it more. And what we did was, it was not a translation job as much as it was a localization. And I personally worked on the Urdu script myself alongside Khizr, Mariam, and a man named Tanveer Afridi, who's very, very helpful in the entire process. And the local cues that you saw, they're also in the English one, but seeing it in Urdu, it changes the context of the movie 100%.
Yeah.
It's a different film in Urdu than it is in English. Visually, it's the same, but the voice acting. One thing I also wanted to do with the voice acting here in Pakistan is there's a lot of overacting in our kind of voiceover work done here.
Yeah,
Again, not saying that's a bad thing. That has its own charm and its own that has its own charm and its own flavor. but I wanted something
Subdued.
more subdued and more natural in the voice acting approach for the Urdu version of the film. And some people say that oh, it's a little flat. I'm like, they'll eventually see when they see the whole film that
No, it's very well in tone with
exactly, exactly. People just aren't.
scheme of how it looks to even the way the score is. Like I told someone, I said the way we watched the movie, like lounging in the Royal Cinema with a chadar on ourselves, that's the way you watch that movie because the music, the score, everything is very not flat at all. It's just it has a mood to it, right? And you go with
Exactly. There's a particular tone that I wanted, and I didn't want to lean into some of the
Hamming.
things that are done here, and I wanted it to be different. And I'm very excited. It did all of the voice direction for the Urdu version of the film.
You
I
did
learned a
yourself?
lot. Yeah, I did it myself. I learned a lot from David Friedman while he was working on the film because I sat in all the sessions.
So the process became familiar.
I saw the entire process, and I was already familiar with the dubbing process, but seeing somebody like David Friedman working, he is incredible. So I learned a lot from him and tried to pick up what I could and implement it here. So while making this movie, I like I said, I've met so many amazing people and learned so much from every single person. It's made me a better artist, made me a better director, made me a
And one thing you said at the screening, which I came back and told my team as well, is you said one of the challenges was कि because movie shoot हुई अंग्रेजी के लिए, so you had to write a script that would limit the words to the mouth expression or the facial movement of the animation, which has been designed keeping the English script in mind, but now you gotta fit Urdu
Yeah.
words in exactly that same amount of time. And when you said that, I was like, I never thought of it that way. कि एक बंदे का मुंह हिल रहा है character का for an English word that might be either shorter or longer than the word you're replacing it with in Urdu. And I think that's kudos to the direction, but also the voice actors.
Definitely. So, talking a little bit about that process, it was kind of like a reverse of what the Japanese animated films have to go through when they're dubbed in English, where they're limited to the amount of syllables the character says for the Japanese voice acting, and then they figure out how to come up with an English equivalent and then fit it in those mouth shapes. We had the English version, so we had to figure out how to get the Urdu version to fit those mouth shapes, which wasn't very difficult. But there were
But it is a
certain,
process.
but there were certain points where we were sitting in the recording studio. I sat with every actor, and I was like, "This line just isn't working. This isn't fitting." And then either we would do a rewrite on the spot because we knew the general tone and what we wanted the line to be. And since I was voice directing it, having directed the film, I knew that okay, if we change this dialogue here, then 6 scenes later it won't really affect that because that's the dialogue there. So it was easy to do in that aspect, but the actors improvised and did a great job. Khalid Anam Saab did a phenomenal job because the father's
The Khalid
character, yeah, the Khalid Anam, he was the voice actor for Tamas.
Acha.
So Art Malik was the voice actor for the English version.
English version.
Art
Also
Malik
another
is
great-
also
great-
an executive
great
producer on
artist.
the film. And Khalid Anam is the voice actor for Tomas on the Urdu version of the film. He had probably the chunkiest lines in the movie. So
And also a lot of aggressive lines, a lot of
a lot of aggressive lines, but a lot of wordy lines. There's very little expositionary dialogue in this film. I'm not a fan of expositionary dialogue, but there's certain things that character had to say, and he's so expressive and articulate in the English version. We really struggled with. We wrote the Urdu version. Writing it wasn't the problem. Getting it to fit the mouth shapes was the problem. And hats off to Khalid Anam Saab. He improvised and he cut a few words here and there and made those lines fit, which kept the tone, kept how articulate the character was. He did a phenomenal job.
This is fantastic. And just capping off this question, when I saw, and I see the value in watching the movie in multiple languages as well, because we do that. I do the same when I'm watching Ghibli.
Hmm.
You often like to watch it in original language with subtitles versus watching a dubbed version, and they're two absolutely extremely different people things. And the same thing has started happening in video games now, where Japanese video games are now people are playing it in original audio, like Ghost of Tsushima, Rise of Ronin. They're like, यार इसको Japanese audio में खेलते हैं. In fact, there's a mode in Ghost of Tsushima called Miyazaki mode, where it goes all black and charcoal, and you play the game like that again, and you go like, wow. So this is, kind of the thought behind it. So tell me about filmmaking in general. Like, has your passion always been making film generally, or making animated films? That's the one question someone wanted to know. And and then I want you to tell me that if it was animated movies, what were those favorite animated movies growing up that kind of shaped your vision and your passion? All of us have those, right? I'm into video games and animated content because I grew up completely enamored by something that I saw for the first time, right? And then set me on that path. So was it filmmaking for you or animated filmmaking? And if it was animated, what were those special things that you saw growing up that completely went like that? इससे बेहतर तो कोई चीज ही नहीं है. This is what I want it to be.
That's a really good question, because I grew up obsessing over animation, and particularly Japanese animation. I loved the Disney films growing up, and Lion King was the first film I saw in the cinema in my life. That film really moved me. But then I also grew up watching a lot of the older Disney works, the ones that he directed himself, and obviously the films Snow White, Pinocchio, Bambi. They just have this level of detail and this darkness in them for a children's film that is not felt in other films that I've seen, especially in a film like Pinocchio with Monstro, the whale, and those sequences, or a lot of sequences in Pinocchio, actually, they're so powerful and impactful. I remember they used to scare me as a child, but I still couldn't get my eyes off of the screen.
Remember
in Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent as well.
Scary.
But there's something very, very special about those early films. And
ये वो ज़माना था hand-drawn.
Yeah, and those are hand-drawn animated films. Those are hand-drawn animated films. That feeling that those films gave me as I was growing up, even before I was 10 years old, I discovered in Japanese animated films, particularly, and it's no surprise here, Studio Ghibli's films, and then even more particularly, Hayao Miyazaki's films. Even though I'm a huge Isao Takahata fan, I think he's an absolute genius. I think his films, like Only Yesterday, is such an amazing exploration of the human psyche and childhood and growing up and the joys and anguish you feel. I think he's phenomenal. But the first Ghibli film that I ever saw in my life, I had a VHS tape of Cartoon Network cartoons.
Yeah.
And it was a pirated tape. Somebody had recorded it on TV. And it was recorded over Kiki's Delivery Service. So when the cartoons ended, Kiki's Delivery Service started in like the 15 minutes into the movie or 20 minutes into the movie. And I just remember as a kid just being like, what is this? There's something so special about it. I didn't understand why. I didn't know who Hayao Miyazaki was. I didn't know what Studio Ghibli was. I just knew that this is something special. And then as I got older, I started learning that there's a director in Japan, Hayao Miyazaki, who makes these amazing animated films. I always start crying when I talk about their movies. It's a problem. But they're just... It is when I'm in every interview I start crying. But
believe me, if people see you crying, there's 50 people out there watching you crying as well, because they're probably equally passionate about it. Dude, I cried when I saw your movie.
Thank you.
Ask them. He asked me what is it. I said, dude, I cried because I was like, like, for me, it was like, ask him. The first thing I told Faisal, I said, dude, I cried. Because I was like, bro, I can't believe this is like made here.
Thank you so much. There's this director, Hayao Miyazaki, who makes these amazing animated films. And then I started getting older. I discovered Princess Mononoke. And then I actually followed as much as I could. There was no real internet and stuff back then. The development of Spirited Away came, and that obviously was huge, and It won the Oscar 2 years after it came out. But I followed like the development of Howl's Moving Castle and then Ponyo,
All of them was
and
amazing.
then rediscovered all of their entire library of films, and all of the directors associated with Ghibli, Hiromasa Yonebayashi and Isao Takahata's work, and it's just amazing. I love their movies. I've seen them
There's nothing
many,
really
many,
like it.
many
To be
times.
very
There's nothing like it.
And so I have kids that are growing up. They're 14, mashallah. And I think I was very grateful to a particular streaming service recently. This year they put all of the Miyazaki and Ghibli movies on there, so that my kids can now see
Mhm.
them in HD or 4K as many times as they want. And then I went like, okay, you start with this, because mine first was Princess Mononoke,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, I was always a huge fan of animated, but I was a huge fan of Western animated,
Mhm.
like huge. But then when I saw that, I was like, yeah, this is something. ये कुछ और है.
Princess
Then
Mononoke
Spirited
is a
Away,
very
yeah,
special
Howls, and the animation is so. The best I would describe it is, it's out of. It's not set in any particular mold.
Yeah.
Every time he creates or they create something, it's just very different. The characters are shaped different. They stylize very differently. And even though it's different every time, it's somehow become their trademark look.
Yeah.
So this one looks nothing like this one, but as a whole, oh, this is typical Ghibli. Oh, this is typical Miyazaki, and which like House Moving Castle. It looks nothing like the first two that came before it, but it somehow looks the same. I don't know if that makes sense.
So when you just chronologically look at their films, when you start with like what I would say is the proto Studio Ghibli film, which is Naushka, uh, it's a development of that style. Hayao Miyazaki has this particular way of drawing characters that is very uh, distinct, and each film they've kind of iterated and built on the fundamentals they laid out earlier on. He's directed films before that too, but Naushka in the what is the full title? Naushka in the Valley of the Wind. The style that was developed in that kept developing till we now are at The Boy and the Heron, or the original title, the How Do You Live. You can see each film getting, I won't say better because all of them look amazing, but just developing the style a bit more, till they've, I think, reached. I think Howl's Moving Castle is their most visually stunning film, just in terms of the color palettes.
Yes.
and the
There's
the
a lot there's a lot
fluidity of
happening
the
on
movie.
screen.
There's a lot happening on screen. Spirited Away is absolutely amazing, but I think visually Howl's Moving Castle is just such a distinct, beautiful film, very colorful, soft palette, and I think that's where they perfected the style. And then with Ponyo, he kind of went back to the drawing board and said that we've explored so much. I want to get back to simpler drawings and uh, almost childlike backgrounds with the color pencils. You can see that development as well after Howl, and then The Wind Rises, which I think is one of his greatest films ever made.
One of the movies that I remember, and I just came to my mind, which is why I couldn't Google it to know who it was. I'm sure it was someone famous that stayed with me. Was actually something I saw while I was traveling in 2020, and it was called The Wolf Children.
That's Mamoru Hosoda, Wolf Children. I
My
love that
God,
film.
I've seen that 4 times. I made my wife see it. It has stayed with me for like. It's just something a story I'd never thought someone would write, and it's just the way it is, the way the woman leaves practically urban civilization, raises kids, and I'm like, yeah, it's such an out there story. I mean,
He's a genius.
fantasy, right?
He's a genius. Mamoru Hosoda, Studio Chizu, he is incredible. I have just like I have Hayao Miyazaki storyboards lined up above my desk. I have Mamoru Hosoda's as well. He is phenomenal. And fun fact, he was actually the first director of Howl's Moving Castle.
Acha.
Yeah, you can look up his storyboards. Some of them leaked online, where he planned for it to go in a completely different direction, and then Hayao Miyazaki kind of stepped in. And I don't know the actual story. I've just read
But
rumors
I think
online.
if someone hasn't seen
But
it, The Wolf Children is such an
he
amazing.
is amazing. His film Summer Wars is one of my favorite films as well. He was the director of the first Digimon movie as well. Um, he
Acha.
always weaves technology in and the internet and how everyone connects online into his films in such an interesting way. You see that in Digimon, you see it in Summer Wars, you see it in Bell. So it's really cool. I think he is one of the uh, in the echelon of directors from Japan for animation. He's one of the best.
And I mean this in the nicest way possible. I've seen, maybe it has something to do with Japanese culture, I don't know. But the age, these are not young people, but the age till which they remain creatively
Yeah.
inspired is phenomenal.
Yeah.
All of these guys are like, their first animated contents came out in like the 80s.
Yeah.
So like 80s are वैसे ही उठा लेते थे 43 years, 42 years ago, right? But generally speaking, even when we go towards, when we look at game development, so one of very famous name that even animators know is Hideo Kojima. Hideo Kojima is a great lover of the art,
Genius. He's a genius.
genius, right? And he's friends with all of these guys, and he promotes their stuff as well. And I'm really hoping he'd put a Glassworker post out as well. But the guy's well into his 60s now, like late 60s, like early 60s, and he's got 4 more projects planned that will keep him occupied for the next decade. And you gotta be like, yeah, just like physical wellness, mental wellness is a real thing with age. And these guys just keep taking out these mind-bendingly amazing stuff, which is amazing.
It's amazing. I look at them like the great directors in Hollywood. You have your Spielberg and
Scorsese's and-
Scorsese, and they make work to connect with people. I feel like that's something that they feel alive when they're working, and I think the creative juices that keep flowing is because they don't know any other form of existence, and they're just so good at what they do. They have to keep creating in order to keep moving forward. And all of the directors in Japan, people like Hideo Kojima, see that in them as well. I don't think there's any difference between
Filmmakers,
the filmmaking directors and animation directors or video game directors. It's they're all cut from the same cloth.
So, Usman, so as you know, there's the animation. Generally, the industry is, even though we have, I'm on paper, we'd say we have a decent sized animation industry, but that's not really to make animated feature films or TV series. Mostly that's for commercial content, right? Like, but we have a lot of talented animation, like people who want to get into animation. We have people who keep writing to IGN, who keep attending our comic cons and stuff like that, and they bring their portfolios and their things. And a lot of them wanted to know that, because you mentioned it in your documentary as well, that you had to learn a lot of things in terms of animation, and then there was no talent here, and you had to create that talent. So a very key question a lot of people had was, what are those animation techniques that you use to create the product, and why was it so unique, and why was it a different approach from what's traditionally done here? Like, what was, I mean, because we all know that the largest part of your effort was getting that training and that talent and people to understand how to do it. So what was so unique about it, and how is it so different from what we normally see?
So the Glassworker was done in traditional frame by frame animation. There was no tweening involved. Every single drawing that you see on screen is a drawing that's made by a person. Every single background that you see on screen is a background that has been hand painted. So the one thing I will say is there's nothing unique in our approach. It's the traditional way that animation is done. Hand-drawn animation is done, where you have your background plate, you have your characters, and then the storyboarding process kind of plans everything out, and then you have various processes like the layout stage, the production board stage, and then it goes into character animation and background painting, and then compositing the shots and putting it all together. So the way we did it, we just had to reverse engineer how to do all of these steps. Storyboarding was simple. I just had to storyboard it. I had to imagine the film and make it along and just plan the whole thing. For the layouts and production boards, it was again standard. We had to just figure out what is going in the background or what the characters will be doing, refining the storyboard, taking it forward. Character animation, the entire animation department, we had to train everybody in the studio while also learning ourselves. So that was the interesting part. Now, there are a bunch of people in the studio who are as obsessive as I am about the craft of animation. Our wonderful animation director, Amir Rifat, our animation supervisor, Saib Irfan, and then me, in terms of just the drawings themselves. I love this craft. I've loved it since I was small. I've been obsessing over it forever. Again, not thinking I will do animation, but just when the opportunity came, I knew how to do it. I had always been doing it in my spare time. I had just enjoyed the craft. I was always drawing. I was drawing as much as I was playing music, so it felt like the perfect combination of everything that I love. So it didn't feel like work figuring these things out. But then everybody had different processes that they implemented. So I'm very, very grateful that I got to work with these remarkable people to kind of build what would become our animation pipeline. But then also with the backgrounds, Mariam was art director on the film. We worked with a phenomenal group of people to create the backgrounds as well. Backgrounds were Nothing is simple in this process. Everything is extremely difficult. The only thing simpler about the backgrounds was that it's one frame that you're making
Yeah.
with multiple layers. Or if I had planned parallax and things in the shots and the storyboards, then they would paint the paintings according to that. But I guess figuring out every single aspect, and then the compositing stage, which again our animation director was also the chief VFX artist on the film. So building all of these systems from scratch, and then our producer Khizr comes in. He's also the line producer on the film. So we had our pipeline, we had our procedure, and then we also had deadlines associated with those in order to complete the finished film. Because you can have all of these amazing processes as much as you want, but if you don't finish the film on time, then what are you doing? So we took the deadline very, very seriously, and everybody worked very, very hard to just maintain a certain standard. And like I said earlier, it will never look like what I wanted it to
Yeah,
look
yeah,
like
yeah.
in my head. But for our first time outing doing this in Pakistan, um, I don't think we could have done any better. And I didn't want to push it further because I had already pushed
It's a
the
lot
whole
enough.
thing so much. So I'm very, very proud of the fact that we were able to make the film in the time frame that was allotted to us, and for it to look the way it does, for it to sound the way it does with all the music and sound design work. Very, very proud of it. But to just come back to your question and answer that, the difficult part was making people see it's possible, and also maintaining that same level of passion, like I said earlier, where it can be done, it can be done, it can be done. And it's very tough. You're sitting in like shots that I've animated. uh, you're just sitting for days just doing the slightest bit of movement to get maybe 1 2 seconds of footage, like 30 40 drawings. For what would the average be if you're doing like 12 frames per second? And I've made like yeah, 48 drawings would be how much? My math is failing me. Like 4 seconds of animation, that's it. So it's a lot of work. And then we had variable frame rates, so
Now,
some
that's
shots.
a huge difference from filmmaking, by the way.
Yeah.
That's one huge difference from filmmaking. The cost of retakes in
Yeah.
terms of time and effort is humongously less than the cost of redrawing.
So that's why you have to be very the planning is crucial. That's why when I said that the production pipeline that was developed was very, very important, because there is a very little margin for error. That's why some shots never got to the animation stage before they were refined in the animatic stage. um, because once the work goes in, and once it's cleaned up, and once it's colored, then you're in a bit of a problem if you have to change it, which we had to do sometimes. Because yeah, not getting into that, sometimes an element just wasn't working. Sometimes in continuity it wasn't working, so you had to go back and revisit certain things. If a shot was edited out by the editor, which is another story, then how can I connect the dots from this shot to that shot? Oh, it would be easy if this object is seen in this shot and then we show it in the next one. So those are the differences in live action filmmaking and animation, particularly hand-drawn animation.